Hello everyone, welcome to my second tutorial. In this tutorial, I will show you how to use Entity Framework and SignalR to make a simple authentication. So before we start, I would like to show you the tables. So we have two tables, person and connections. Person is just a user in our program, and connections is just used to keep track of every time user establishes a new connection using SignalR. So let's look inside. We have a person with ID as a unique identifier, name, username, and password. And then we have a connection with the person ID, which can be used as a foreign key for the person table, SignalR ID, and a timestamp, just so we can have another variable additionally to keep track of every time user logs in. So in order to get the communication working between our REST or server to the database, SQL in this case, we will need a couple steps. I'm going to be using Entity Framework as a communication method, and before we start, we will need a couple NuGet packages. So we would make sure you're not compiling. Go here, NuGet package manager, and manage packages for the solutions. So in here you would need all of these guys. Once you install all of them, we can close this, and assuming we already created these, we should run the scaffold. So this is the scaffold. What it does, it creates a context with all the DB sets for each entity, and that way you can communicate between the tables and make certain calls to the database, to the entities, etc. So to kind of explain this, this is our connection string. I'm just using simple connection string to the local database. Database name is SignalR because I'm using that database name for these demos, and trusted connection true, which is just simple connection string, right? And then we have don't pluralize, because Entity Framework 5, I believe, or maybe even 4, started pluralizing the entities. So if you have an entity person, like in my case, it would pluralize it and it would become people. So yeah, it kind of sounds unusual, but that's why I have this here to prevent that. We have output directory, EF models. That's just where would you want to put in all of those classes that Entity Framework scaffold would create. So in our case, it creates connections because of the connections table, person because of person table, and SignalR context, which is just database context in our case. It always gets the name of the database and it just appends context. So the next thing would be tables, which you specify which tables you want. So I want person and connection, and dash force just for the force flag. So yeah, let's see how this works. So you would run this inside of tools, NuGet package manager console. So yeah, I'm gonna rerun this and it would overwrite. So if every time you run this, it would overwrite all of these, in my case, all of these 3 classes. Things to keep in mind is to make sure that your entities have primary keys in order for this to work. So make sure connections, my primary key is ID, and for the person the same. You can right click, make sure that's a primary key. So another thing would be to add, this is not necessary, but I like to add the default data binding for the IDs. So in case you add a new entity, you can have, in case you want to add a new entry later, you can have a new ID. The good thing about Entity Framework scaffold, is it always sees all of these attributes and it generates them. So we can see that here in the SignalR we have property, connections ID, and has default binding new ID. So basically copies everything, all the properties, what their format, sometimes if we have constraints, and that creates this context which has the connection ID from here. The connection ID also needs to be specified inside of app settings, which I called my connections, and just provided this connection string. So the reason this is important to have here is because of the startup. We need to add these, and once you add that, you will need to create you need to add a new database context pool where your context is the context that you scaffold, and you would get the you would connect to that context by using your connection ID provided here. My connection. So yeah, once you've done these steps, that's as far as startup go for the second tutorial. Everywhere you see second tutorial, that means those are the stuff from the second tutorial. This is the stuff from the first one. So you would not, if you've done these steps before, you would not have to look into them. So let's move on to the next thing. So let's run this. So once we run that, make sure that before you run this, your project has to have no errors, because if it has error, it would say build failed. So after you run that, you would also have to remove the default constructor from the context, as I wrote here. So these are the things you would have to do before you get to this point, right? So what I mean by that is this is also not necessary for debug purposes. It just tell you to protect your connection string. You can delete that, and always delete this default constructor, because you would have some pooling issues. So once you do that, you can save and exit that. And now we finally get to the my hub, which I raised the previous methods that were here. And what I'm doing is I'm creating this context variable that is of type SignalR context, of our context from the database, and I'm injecting that into our constructor, and I'm making this variable to that context. So one thing to keep in mind is make sure to get all of this to work, you will need to use using for all the models you have created, Entity Framework models, your hub config, which just to see the hub itself, and these two guys are necessary for the Entity Framework. So we will come back to this function that's just for the authentication. Let's go back to the client. So for the client, you would need to install Bootstrap, and I created for the testing purposes new component and put it into app module. So you can run these commands to generate your components. I created home component and auth component. So we can see that here I wrote a comment, everything I modified in this for this tutorial. So once you ran all these three commands, you would modify your style CSS to see the Bootstrap. Also in the app routing, you would add routes. In this case, I just did it kind of simple for when it's not specified, go to auth. If it's auth, go to auth. If it's home, go to home. And if it's any other, go to auth. So the next file would be SignalR service. Here I injected a router. Also I created a person name, just a simple string, and that's it. In the auth, this might look like a lot of work, but it's actually just a Bootstrap form where you have a auth form, which is just a simple ng form, template form, and on submit, once you click the submit button, you would send that form. And we have a username that would ng model our username, and we have a password, ng model password, and just a simple submit button. By the way, all of this code is going to be on the GitHub, so you don't have to bother typing all of this. You can just go there and copy. The next thing would be for the auth component TS. Here I did most of the work. So in the constructor, I injected SignalR service, and I also added on init and on destroy. Basically, in on init, I do the listeners for the listening for the success or the fail of the authentication. In on ng on destroy, I'm destroying those listeners as I go to the next page. In this case, home page. Once assuming our authentication is valid, right? So once we type in our credentials on this form, and type in username, type in password, press login. Once we do that, then it would come to here, see if the form is valid, and if the form is valid, then we would call the auth me and provide our username and password as parameters. Auth me is just a function when we pass in username and password, store it inside of person info, and invoke auth me method on the hub. And once that function is called, we would just prompt to the toaster login in attempt. So now we can go back to the server, explain this function. So how this work? So as you can see here, I'm actually saving my connection ID in just a string variable, because I'm using it on multiple spots. Here, I'm just doing a very, very basic authentication procedure where I'm checking if the username that's typed in, matches the username from the person table. Just a basic link queue. And same goes for the password. If a password matches the password from the form, find an entry. So I'm using SignalR default because I'm expecting only one result of this person. If the person comes as one result, that means this condition would pass. So here I'm just simply prompting the name and the connection ID of the person. So we're going to add a new connections entry where person ID is going to be the person ID that we found up here, and SignalR ID is the current SignalR ID, and datetime now just for the timestamp. Once we do that, we can add that and save the context. Save changes. Make sure you run both of these afterwards because that's what saves to the database. This adds to the entity, and this commits to the database. You can also do await ctx save changes async if you need it. So once we save the changes, we will make a call to the client sending the response as success and pass that temp person, which in this case is just the user that we found to be logged in, and that would send our ID, name, username, and password, which of course it's not a good practice to send a password, but this is just for the simple test, right? So in case the person typed the wrong password, this would be null, and that means it would go into the else statement and then sending our responses fail. One thing I wrote this comment here is because you can be more efficient with the way you call it. So one way is to call await client and provide a current SignalR, or shortcut for that would be just like I have in the line above. You can do .caller, and you can also experiment with other a lot of variables here that IntelliSense provides. But yeah, caller in this case would be the simplest. I mean, that means send this to the person that called this function. So yeah, we can now run this. So once we run that, we're gonna make sure that we listen on the client side for those events to hit, right? Once these guys fire. So in here, I created two listeners. So in our auth.me listener success, we would have auth.me response success listener that would accept person info of type any in this case. Any is basically, you can grab any. You can also strictly type this. In this case, I don't really care because it's very small object, irrelevant. You can console log that, so you can see what you get. I'm also making my person name to the name of the person that got logged in. And I'm prompting out as a toaster, login success, and navigating myself to the home page, right? If it fails, I'm just going to prompt toaster error, wrong credentials. And next two things here, they're very tiny. I created on the home page, just saying person name and welcome to home, just as a greetings. And here in the home page, I'm just injecting SignalR service, so it would be visible right here as a person name. Okay, so let's give this a try. We can refresh this. As we can see, connection started. If I try anything, that was almost instantaneous. As you can see, SignalR has very impressive speed. Those are wrong credentials. So the speed that I'm talking about is actually keep track like how fast this actually gets done. So like when I click login, we have login in attempt and then wrong credentials immediately. What that does is actually saying finally login in attempt after you make auth.me call. And when that happens, it goes to here, checks all the stuff, and makes a call back saying, prompting the toaster again, saying that login is successful or login or wrong credentials. And you can see that speed is just amazing to see the both of them appear back and forth to the server, to the database, from the database back to the server, and then from the server to the client again. So let's try the correct username, which in this case, and username and password will be user and pass. So if we type user, pass, and this is just a normal warning because it's a very simple password. It's just saying it's breached. Don't pay attention to that. You can see that like we logged in successfully. John Smith, welcome to home. And we can see our credentials and other information here. Okay, so let's see that step by step. So yeah, first of all, we can put breakpoints once we log in, once we get events from the server, and once we're at the server for the login. So let's run that. So as I'm typing something, this hits. It would say auth.me, see the username, password. It would come here. As I told you before, if it doesn't find any entry, it would just return a null, which would come here in the else statement and give the response fail, which makes sense as predicted. And it would say toaster wrong credentials. Yeah, as expected. So the next try would be to type in correct. So the user pass, again hit here, and inside of here we would find the person. That person is right here, and if that's not null, we would come in here, print out, add to the database, and that's it. Here we would hit the success listener, and we would press continue. We're logged in. So yeah, one thing I can mention also, that you can like easily keep track of the things you do and like keep track of the backend with just simple console line. So we can see here how John Smith logged in as a different user, well, as a different connection ID every time. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. The next tutorial would be how to use Entity Framework and SignalR and actually preserve the session upon a refresh. Because as of right now, this doesn't do it. It's just a simple authentication procedure. So I hope everything was clear, and thank you for watching.